Chapter 26, once again, we're focusing on the time period 1865 to about the end of the century, but this time focusing on the Western Plains and the agricultural revolution. Now, to start with, Native Americans in 1860, there were about 360,000 Native Americans in the West. But as more and more whites began moving in, this is obviously going to create a problem between these tribes of people versus the Native Americans already living there. Also, we have to take a look at the role that white people have already played in transforming Native American culture out on the plains. That stereotypical image of the Native American on horseback hunting the buffalo would only have been possible because of white settlement, because horses were not introduced until the Spanish arrived in the New World. So even the image of Native Americans in our eyes is affected by white settlement. The Cheyenne and Sioux, as an example, were not nomadic hunters until the horses were introduced. Prior to that, they had been hunters and traders. But with the use of the horse, they become nomadic hunters, following the buffalo around on the plains, which is going to be difficult as more and more whites start infiltrating the western frontier, mainly as the railroad starts moving further and further west and more whites start farming on the western plains or moving west on the railroad. They bring with them disease and also hunting and killing the buffalo to near extinction. This is going to create a lot of stress on Native American cultures that are so reliant on the buffalo, because many of these cultures, like the Sioux as a prime example, used every part of the buffalo, and their entire society was based on using the buffalo. This is going to be very difficult with the buffalo nearly gone at this time. Also at this time, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which we've already talked about before, created during Andrew Jackson's time in office, is going to play a large role in making treaties with the different tribes on the western frontier, trying to force the Native Americans onto smaller and smaller reservations or smaller and smaller amounts of land in order to create more land for western settlers, namely the homesteaders who were moving west in the 1860s and 1870s. We see two major reservations created at this time. The Great Sioux Reservation, which is namely in the Dakota Territory, and then also Indian Territory, which was Oklahoma. Now, as more and more Americans start moving west, this is going to create a lot of tension with Native Americans already living out there. There was brutality on both sides of the coin, not just between Americans towards natives, but also natives towards the Americans as well, because they felt that they were encroaching on their land. For example, Sioux warriors massacred 81 of Captain Fetterman's soldiers in the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming. They felt that they were encroaching on their territory as they came in looking for the gold mines along the Bozeman Trail. But as a result of this massacre, this forced the American government to retreat a little bit and supposedly guarantee the Sioux their right to the Great Sioux Reservation, which is modern-day North and South Dakota. This is not going to last very long, because in 1874 gold was discovered in the Black Hills, which is in South Dakota, also part of the Sioux Reservation. As gold diggers started pouring into the Great Sioux Reservation, obviously encroaching upon the Sioux territory, Colonel George Custer in the American Army once again came in to try to protect these gold diggers and faced off against the Sioux warriors, led at this time by Sitting Bull, the great Sioux chief. At Custer's last stand, or at the Battle of Little Bighorn, as it's also referred to, 25 American soldiers were 2,500 Sioux warriors destroyed the 264 men under the control of Colonel Custer. This is in 1876, also known as Custer's Last Stand. Following this battle at Little Bighorn, Sitting Bull was exiled up into Canada, because he had to escape the control of the U.S. Army. Another example of Americans versus the Native Americans on the plain had to do with the tribe, the Nez Perce, led at this time by Chief Joseph. In 1877, the Nez Perce refused to sign a treaty with the American government that would have effectively pushed them onto a very small reservation. Instead, they were battling against the American army, and many of the Nez Perce warriors tried to link up with the men that were under the control of Sitting Bull up in Canada. The problem was that they were forced to surrender when the women and children back at home on their ancestral lands were being forced onto the reservations and were dying in droves, and so the Nez Perce soldiers were essentially forced to give in and were forced onto reservations in Kansas, where 40% of them died from disease. Here is Chief Joseph and the end result of the Battle of Little Bighorn. So overall, and we're glossing over lots of things here right now, but overall the reservation system that was being created at this time, namely with the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, is basically nothing less than the destruction of Native American traditions and culture on the western frontier. Essentially, by forcing these people onto reservations, we are denying them their right to self-autonomy. We are denying them their right to hunt the buffalo, which it's difficult to say here is a small amount of territory that is completely yours when their entire lifestyle is following the herd of the buffalo. But as the railroad comes in, and this is really the reason for the reservation system, is to open up the western frontier for more white settlement, they bring with them disease, they bring with them the extermination or the near extermination of the buffalo because of the use of hunting on the western frontier, and also in order to open up the grassy plains to cattle ranchers and cowboys because the buffalo were in the way. By the end of the Civil War, there were approximately 15 million buffalo on the Great Plains, but by 1885, they were hunted to near extinction. This is absolutely going to affect Native American cultures that are completely focused on using the buffalo for every single part of their life. So, how did whites settle, or how did white Americans view Native Americans? There are really two schools of thought at this time in terms of what to do with Native Americans out west. You have the humanitarian side of this, and you have the more hardline side of this. The humanitarian side is more focused on assimilating these Native Americans into white culture, to getting them to give up their cultural identity in exchange for becoming more like white people. On the other side are the more hardline advocates who are focusing on forcing these people to submit, forcing them onto reservations, and if they don't, give in to withhold food, medicine, supplies, whatever is necessary until they kowtow to the white Americans at this time. Notice that neither of these perspectives is focusing on allowing the Native Americans to retain their unique cultural identity. Helen Hunt Jackson, who was a favorite AP test question in May, she wrote 2 books at this time. She represents that humanitarian side, or the assimilationist side of the discussion. 2 of her books were called A Century of Dishonor in 1881 and Ramona in 1884. She had meant A Century of Dishonor to almost be like the Uncle Tom's Cabin for dealing with Native Americans, to get white Americans to see the horrors that were going on at this time and to help these people assimilate to white culture. But notice, like I said before, nobody is focusing on allowing them to maintain their unique cultural identity. And as part of the deal for moving onto reservations and receiving more and more government handouts, because that's what ultimately became necessary since the buffalo were nearly gone, the U.S. government was under the Bureau of Indian Affairs was also focusing on assimilating these people to the religion of the white Americans, or Christianizing them. Christian missionaries were very popular on the western frontier. And in 1884, the Bureau of Indian Affairs outlawed the Sundance ritual, which was a popular ritual among many Native American cultures. Out of sheer sadness and longing for the way things used to be, we see, starting with the Paiute tribe but then expanding elsewhere, the rise of the ghost dance. This is a cultural dance that was started, like I said, by the Paiute, which basically the focus of the ghost dance was calling for an end to white expansion, to have a return of the buffalo, and advocating for cross-cultural cooperation among all the Native Americans in order to work together. However, many white people misinterpreted what the ghost dance was actually all about. And as the U.S. government started breaking more and more treaties with the different tribes at this time, the ghost dance became more and more popular. At Wounded Knee, which is on the Great Sioux Reservation in 1890, the U.S. government once again was forcing the Sioux in this location to move onto a smaller parcel of land in order to make more room for the white homesteaders moving west. Their transition was to be monitored by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and if they went quietly, they would be provided more and more food. The ghost dance that was being practiced there frightened many of these white agents. They thought it was a war dance mistakenly and called in the military in order to disarm the people on the Sioux reservation. Because of an altercation with a deaf Sioux man, while disarming them, a gun went off and a massacre ensued at Wounded Knee. 200 men, women, and children were killed by American soldiers at this time. Historically, this has often been referred to as a battle until very recently it's been changed to a massacre, because that's exactly what it is when men, women, and children are killed while running for their lives. Here you see the aftermath of the massacre at Wounded Knee. Part of the change in American policy started in 1887. A very important piece of legislation was passed called the Dawes Act, or the Dawes Severalty Act. Basically, this is, once again, forcing assimilation down the throats of Native Americans. The tribal lands, which had once been held in common by the tribe, was now dissolved, and in exchange, individual plots of land of 160 acres were to be given to each male head of the household in order to almost force people among these tribes to give up their communal way of life and instead farm as individual heads of the household. If they abided by this, they would promise citizenship rights in 25 years. This never happened. But really the reason here is to free up land for more and more railroads to come through and more white settlement, because all of the land that had once been held by the different tribes would not equal how much land was necessary for each male head of the household to have 160 acres of land. So really, this is all about destroying the native culture and forcing white assimilation on them. This was eventually undone in 1934 during FDR's presidency with the Indian Reorganization Act, oftentimes referred to as the Indian New Deal. Another example of forced assimilation at this time is with the creation of the Carlisle Indian School and other schools like it. Basically, similar to what we see with immigrant children, if the way you get immigrant children to assimilate is by sending them to school, why not do the same thing with Native Americans? So in 1879, this Indian school was formed in Pennsylvania to take Native children away from their families out west and to send them east, to force them to dress in white-style clothing, to live a Christian lifestyle, and to adopt a Christian name. And their goal was to, quote, kill the Indian but save the man, to literally beat the Indian out of them. Here you see a picture of the Carlisle School, and this is similar in other Indian schools across the country as well. And now on to the growth and the rise of the mythical cowboy in American society. We have a very romantic image of who the cowboys were in this country, but really the era of the cowboy is extremely short-lived. At the end of the Civil War, the Longhorn cattle, who it's a very specific breed to Texas, were down in Texas, obviously, and they were mostly being slaughtered at this time for their hides. It was too difficult to get the meat to market before it would go rancid because there was no railroad connecting Texas to the eastern part of the country. But as that transcontinental railroad came westward, it became easier then, obviously, to get that meat onto those refrigerated cars and shipped back to the east. And so the meat packing trusts were focusing on getting these cattle northward to what were known as the cow towns, towns like Abilene, Kansas, and Dodge City, which were basically railroad terminals where the cowboys, and they were multicultural, white, black, and Mexican, would drive herds of cattle over the open plain to these cow towns where they would be slaughtered and put on the railroad cars and shipped back east for their meat. The era of the cowboy is very short-lived, though, like I said, because with the railroad also comes more and more homesteaders, these farmers moving west looking to settle the Great Plains. And as the farmers moved west, they did not want cows trampling across their agricultural products, and so they used the newly designed product of barbed wire to close off their individual farms. So with the use of barbed wire, we see the closing off of the open range, and it made it very difficult for cowboys to move their cattle on across the open plains. Eventually, this does lead to the creation of cattle ranches, which ends up being more profitable because the cattle can now be a little bit meatier because they're not walking across several hundred miles of open terrain.